That's because this is really one country. Whether you call it the Holy Land, whether you call it Palestine, even whether you call it Israel, it doesn't really change the reality that this is one geographic entity that has many claims placed on it. The claim of Zionism, which grew much stronger in the post-World War II world after the Holocaust. The claim of Arab nationalism, which had been put under by the Ottomans, had been pushed under by the British, now was pushed under by the Zionists and the Americans. I don't share anything theologically with the people in Hamas. I have met some of them by accident on the many trips that I've taken, over 100 trips to Israel and Palestine in the last 15 years. I find them very dignified people, very thoughtful people, people very aware of their history and their heritage, people fighting for their self-determination, for their freedom, for their dignity, just as other people in other parts of the world fight for theirs. But here in the United States especially, we cast them as crazies and terrorists and renegades and killers. You know, we actually do to them the same thing that we did for 20 years to the PLO.
And the reason that we're so glad to have you today is you're one of the most prolific English language Palestinian writers. You've written 3 major books. The first one, which someone like myself read in the 70s, which was actually my introduction to the Palestinian cause, The Disinherited, probably still your most famous book.
It is, yes. It's still in print, and it's still being used on campuses around the country as a textbook in Middle Eastern studies, in Third World literature and poetics and so on, yes.
Then in the 80s you wrote Soul in Exile, I believe, which was sort of a sequel to The Disinherited?
Pretty much, you might call it a sequel. I, being a Palestinian writer, who has lived in exile pretty much since the age of 8, certainly in Western exile since the age of, since my late teens, let's say, I have had to draw on material from my background, my tragic background as a Palestinian, you see. So clearly most of my writing is preoccupied with trying to deal with the world of exile that we inhabit, the world of Palestinians who live in refugee camps, or Palestinians who live outside the camps, but scattered around the world, not just the Arab world, do you see?
So you're a man who grew up as a child on the streets of Beirut selling chiclets for a penny. I remember that sequence in your book. You've traveled all over the world. You've been involved with the Palestinian cause, with the PLO all your life. You've been a Palestinian writer, revolutionary. And here we now face a situation where in your latest book, which has just come out, which is Exile's Return, I believe, the unusual thing is that after a lifetime of struggle, you are now in opposition.
War, for the first time, brought the United States front and center into the Middle East. It made it clear that the client regimes in the major countries were not popularly based regimes, but were regimes kept in power because the United States kept them there. The Gulf War, in a sense, changed the whole configuration. On top of that, the Cold War ended. So you no longer had the Arab states playing the Soviet Union off against the United States. In the last couple years, the American government has been saying to the Israeli government, you've got to do something. There's just too much upheaval, too much protest, not to mention that the Arab regimes are telling us that this is tremendously harming their own legitimacy and causing the possibility of tension and revolution in their own societies. Now, we, the United States government, do not want to see revolution in these countries, which, by the way, really means democracy in these countries, because all of these countries are held in bondage by regimes that were placed there either by the British or by ourselves, none of which have any popular legitimacy, and all of which are involved in forms of intimidation and repression of their own population.
I have known Yasser Arafat intimately over the years, and you're correct, yes, a few years back, I did fly with him for a whole week, day in, day out. He gave me unprecedented access to him in order to write a book about him, i.e. A Week in the Life of Yasser Arafat. As it turned out, the book didn't pan out because there was not enough material there to warrant writing a book.
Well, you couldn't have been going around calling his people henchmen at the time. I don't
No,
think
I didn't call them henchmen at the time. I was unquestionably critical of them at the time. And they were tolerant of me because they felt I was a Palestinian writer, poet, artist, and therefore a little bit off.
Finally, the PLO was on its deathbed. Yasser Arafat's PLO had disintegrated. His legitimacy had been undermined by Hamas, which has more popular support in Palestine than does his PLO. His financing had been cut off by the Arab regimes, which were now indebted to the United States for having saved the status quo in the Gulf and having destroyed the Iraqi army and returned the emir to his throne in Kuwait. The PLO essentially had been defeated, which is what the Israelis and the Americans had been attempting to do for a great long time. Well, on the other hand, the Israelis needed somebody to deal with. They needed some Palestinian entity to try to create this police force situation with. Well, they tried to negotiate with the team from the occupied territories, but the team from the occupied territories was unwilling to sign the deals that the Israelis wanted to offer them. Then they found that their only option was to get Yasser Arafat to sign these deals. Now, why did he sign them? Arafat had always said he wouldn't. Arafat had ordered the negotiating team never to sign those kinds of deals. But when he was faced with his own loss of power and the total collapse of the PLO, and he was literally within weeks or months of that, he had no funds, there was rebellion in the ranks, there had been defections from the leadership of the PLO. Arafat obviously decided that he was going to choose personal survival over institutional policies.
Tell us about Yasser Arafat. Tell us about what you think about the man and why he has subjugated his people to this kind of an agreement.
Well, I mean, look, Yasser Arafat is yet another Arab leader. He's not a revolutionary leader. He doesn't have the penetrative grasp of political life that, you know, Castro or Mao Zedong or Lenin
Or Mandela.
Or Mandela, thank you for reminding me, had. Yasser Arafat is a simple man, bordering on being a simpleton in terms of his grasp of the political realities of the world. He's a typical Arab leader. He's a patriarch. He is running, or he used to run, a political organization, the PLO, in the same manner that Arab leaders led their governments, led their countries.
Putting it in somewhat different language, what you're really saying is that the PLO has become a client regime. Welcome to Mideast Realities. Our guest today is Hisham Ahmed. Hisham is a professor of international affairs. He's from Dheisheh refugee camp in Palestine. Dheisheh is a large refugee camp near Bethlehem, which is in the Israeli occupied territories, not part of the agreements that have been made recently. And we're very fortunate that he's visiting the United States. And we're very lucky to have him here today to talk about the real situations, the Mideast reality situations in the Middle East.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, Hisham, I know that you've been living after teaching in the States and after getting a PhD in the States. And also, let me just tell the audience, Hisham is a very exceptional person. He was born in Dheisheh camp. He was born blind in Dheisheh camp in a tent. Somehow got a PhD in international affairs and has taught international affairs here in the States, and then about a year ago decided it was time to go home. So you've been living in Jerusalem and Dheisheh for the past year, this exciting year, or this tragic year. Tell us about the conditions there and tell us what your views of recent political developments are.
Well, it's exciting because it is tragic, actually. Two terms seem to be paradoxical, but seem to be intertwined in the situation there. As far as conditions are concerned, I've visited the area several times before, in 1987, before that, and things were absolutely difficult then. People couldn't move around freely. They couldn't speak freely, they couldn't act freely, certainly, in addition to the total denial of their national existence by the Israelis. But this past year, things were a lot more difficult than ever before that I have seen. Primarily, the psyche of the people has been extremely devastated. After 7 years of intifada activities, people feel that their activities didn't really pay off. They have been hindered, they have been aborted, and not much has been achieved. The occupation is still there. The curfews are a daily occurrence, especially in refugee camps. The blockade around Jerusalem has absolutely made people's movement impossible to and from Jerusalem. It has devastated the social fabric in that Palestinians, let's say, living in Bethlehem, who have to cross Jerusalem to get to Ramallah, cannot visit Ramallah anymore, and vice versa.
So the occupation and the agreement, which is now in a sense part of the occupation, have really divided city from city, group from group, area from area.
I think the most difficult question that the people are really dealing with, consciously and subconsciously, is that if there is an agreement, if there is a peace process unfolding, why is it that simultaneously the brutalities of the occupation are increasing rather than decreasing? It's a very difficult question that the people are raising almost on a daily basis. Almost every time the media talks about some new proposals, some new agreements as far as the peace process is concerned, Israeli crackdown on Palestinian society gets on the rise. The blockade around Jerusalem wasn't that tight last year, but this year it's almost 100%
But why
tight.
is this, Hisham? The purpose is to beat down the people so that if there are any improvements, the agreement can be said to have created a few improvements. Isn't that really what this is all about?
I think that's in part indeed the case, to at the end try to basically to trace any positive developments to the agreements, but I think there is even something more to it. I think the Israelis know quite well that constant crackdowns on the Palestinian society will exhaust the society, will frustrate the people, will force the people at the end, the people themselves, which they haven't been able to do, to succumb.
Well, the occupation has been repackaged to a certain degree, but tell us very candidly, what is this agreement in your mind? What has happened in the last year?
Well, where to begin? On the one hand, the people are quite thirsty and hungry for change. They can't stand the occupation anymore. They have suffered very deeply, very profoundly from the occupation. They have put a lot of hopes on their symbolic national representative, the PLO, all these years. They have paid with their lives, with blood, with their houses, with almost everything they had. On the one hand, to reassert their connectedness with the representative, with the PLO, and therefore they have put a lot of hopes on that representative. Now, over the past year, that the solutions proposed are confined to a very, very minuscule piece of geography of Palestine, have created a serious credibility gap in Palestinian society. People don't trust leaderships anymore. They feel that something wrong is just taking place and that their cause is not being served. There was a lot of euphoria at one point last year when the Oslo Accords were talked about. People didn't know exactly what the accords were, what they contained. At the signing in Washington, there was some euphoria in the streets. People thought that the occupation was coming to an end, similar to the euphoria felt at the time of signing the Declaration of Independence in '88. But once the ice melted, and once the people knew quite well that this was nothing more than symbolics, and that ornamentations just for media coverage, they started to be very resentful. When the police force came into Jericho and came into Gaza, again, the people living on the strip and in Jericho felt some change. But that feeling was quite a cautious feeling. They did not have a lot of anticipation, a lot of hope, because they feel that they have been betrayed before, they have been disappointed before, and why shouldn't it be the same this time?
Let's speak very openly, very candidly. The purpose of this show is to talk about Mideast realities. What's your view as a person who's lived as a Palestinian nationalist all your life, but you've been able to travel, you've met people all over the world. What's your view of Yasser Arafat and the PLO?
Well, it's quite a complex question. In the sense, my people put a lot of hopes on the PLO, put a lot of hopes on Arafat, and they expected the leadership, the organization, to deliver at least on some of these hopes and some of these promises. That's not being the case now, and that certainly leaves, I think, a scar on individuals as well as collectively. The PLO is not the PLO that the people used to think it was, of course, several years ago, and even those involved in the PLO nowadays talk about its dissolution and about its transformation into something else. And
isn't what really is going on that the Israelis have won? That Palestinian society has collapsed? That there are no institutions any longer that represent the Palestinians? That they've been turned into police forces and cops on behalf of the occupation?
I personally feel, I mean, I have no doubt in my mind, at least that's at least the way I feel, that the Palestinian society, regrettably, at least it's the political side of the society has been utterly defeated. I have no doubt at the same time that the Israelis have won quite an impressive victory. They have been able to build their own society. At the same time, they have been able to almost liquidate Palestinian society institutionally, socially, psychologically, economically, and politically.
Plus they have other goals as well, don't they? Aren't they economically moving toward trade agreements with the Arab states? They have diplomatic relations with the Vatican. The image that Israel now portrays is an image of a state that made an honorable and just peace, but in reality the Palestinians are kept on Bantustans and reservations.
I think that's the foremost dynamic behind the signing by the Israelis and the involvement by the Israelis in these agreements. I think there is a compelling feeling on the part of the Israeli political leadership that the United States has its own economic, financial problems, and the degree of support it has been giving to the Israelis will not necessarily continue in years to come. Therefore, since the Arab world is closer geographically to the Israelis, why not try to bridge the gap and widen Israeli market into the Arab world? After all, Israeli products are quite competitive in Palestinian society. Why wouldn't that be the case also in other Arab societies? The political atmosphere is quite fertile. What the Israelis badly needed was a form of Palestinian legitimization for the Israelis to enter the Arab market publicly. I venture to say that they have done that, perhaps not as publicly as they will do it now, but they have done it in the past.
Well, Arafat was maneuvered to give them this entree. But what about the Arab world itself? You're a professor of international affairs. You've lived in this part of the world. Your future, your family, your life is tied up in this part of the world. Tell us a bit about your view of what's going on in the region and what brought this state of affairs in Palestine about.
Well, there is an incredible, almost unbridgeable gap between civil society in the Arab world. Even the term itself, I mean, it's quite an obscure term that people are not used to even talk about it, on the one hand, and of course the political society, the governments, the regimes. There is hardly anything that would connect the two. We find the governments in the Arab world acting and thinking in a manner totally inconsistent with the demands, the aspirations, the hopes, and certainly the needs of the overwhelming majority of their peoples. Egypt is a case in point, and I venture to say that perhaps the rest of the societies are in the same boat. Another characteristic, of course, is that whenever stability seems to take place in the Arab region, we are very likely to see some form of conflict erupting. Once the Gulf War settled, a couple of years after, the conflict in Yemen ensued. The Arab region seems to be really doomed to instability, total lack of tranquility, total manipulation of its resources, and certainly total manipulation also of its political will by external powers, but also it has over the years become a function of internal ills, socialization over the years, acculturation based on submissive attitudes to the authorities, based on total submission to the authority, has led people basically not to question, not to act, and more importantly, to be frustrated, I think. There are exceptions. We see that from time to time in Algeria, taking different forms, in Egypt, here and there. But by and large, the Arab peoples themselves are not likely to act in the very near future. I think that's a cycle that will...
Well, then you're suggesting that the regimes that are in power, and the Americans, who of course play the role as superpower, and the Israelis as a role as regional superpower, you're suggesting this is a reasonably stable arrangement and likely to continue then?
By and large, my fear is that that status quo will continue for a while, for a long time actually. There will be some tensions from time to time, there will be some clashes here and there, but on the whole, the region is not to see the light of day in the foreseeable future.
As the game of nations is played, which means that justice and human rights are not in the forefront, but power and economic resources are in the forefront, the Americans and the Israelis are pretty much on top.
Let's put it this way. I mean, the Arab region, in my view, will be out of questions pertaining to culture, to civilization, to prosperity, to modernity for quite a long time. It's not the case that there are no talented people there. It's not the case that there are no skilled people. But it certainly is the case that such talents are suppressed, liquidated, marginalized, or basically forced to leave the region.
What about the role of the Islamic national movements, which, if you would agree with me, are a counter-reaction to all of the things we've been talking about?
Their influence will be on the rise as well, to varying degrees in the Arab world. They will continue to pose a threat to certain governments. But again, I think their role will be contained. They will be contained, and by the governments as well as by other interested parties. I think the Israelis themselves are quite concerned about the spread of Islamic influence, let's say, in Egypt, and it is in their interest to keep such influence under control. It's at the same time in their interest to inflame tensions from time to time between the Islamists and the government, between the Islamists, let's say, in Palestinian society, and the nationalist forces, or the secularists, let's say. It will keep such societies busy with inner conflicts, but such conflicts should not totally get out of control, because they will be very disruptive to the broader, to the more overriding interests the Israelis have in mind.
You don't foresee revolutions such as took place in Iran taking place in other parts of the region?
I don't see it taking place really right now. It doesn't mean that it won't, but that's at least the way I see things for the time being. There will be attempts of fundamental change taking the Islamic shape or perhaps other shapes. But I think the scheme for keeping the Arab world under control, for keeping the Arab region contained because of its resources, because of the political realities of the region, is quite sincere, and I think the scheme is quite in process, and I don't see it being disrupted in the foreseeable future.